everybody. It's so nice to see you all here at our webinar on AI. And we're very interested in this, of course, with the journals for the IADR. It's relatively new, and most people are having issues in understanding exactly what we can and can't do with AI. So when we polled all the members of our scientific and editorial advisory boards to ask what questions they had, there were many questions about the use of AI and how reviewers and editors can look out for it. So this part of our conversations with editors will cover AI and all of the questions that you had. We've put them together, and we'll be going through them. So I'm Jocelyne Feine. I'm the editor-in-chief of the JDR CTR, and I'm going to turn it over to Nick to introduce himself, and then Falk. Nick, go
Yes,
ahead.
hi. Thanks, Jocelyn, and thanks for joining the webinar. So I'm Nick Jakubowicz. I'm editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dental Research. I'm based at Newcastle University in the UK.
Yep. And I'm Falk Schwendeke. I'm in Munich, in Germany. My background is originally in cardiology and minimal invasive dentistry. And over the last nearly 10 years now, it moved to artificial intelligence in dentistry with various different perspectives, mainly over the last years, not necessarily only model development, but also looking at governance, looking at how can we make AI safe and better in dentistry. And that's why I think this is an important webinar. And it's also important that our profession, the scientific world in dentistry, gets a perspective and a position on this important topic.
Thank you so much. So let's go ahead and just get started. First of all, just a general question. What do we mean by AI? Falk, can you start this off?
Yeah, of course. Well, AI is a thing which isn't new. We are just talking about this much more now than we did in the past. It has been around for more than 80 years, and it's founded on the idea that we want to build machines which can automate human intellectual tasks. And that could mean talking, like what we are doing now, and many people will know in the audience, the Turing test, where Alan Turing said, if you can make conversation with a machine for a certain amount of time without noticing that's a machine, that's artificial intelligence. Of course, it's only one dimension of AI, but it's an important one, particularly now that we're talking about these language models. AI itself usually runs in many, many cases using machine learning, so a certain paradigm where machines try to, on their own, understand patterns, associations, and so on in data. And over the past 9 years, roughly, or 10 years, in dentistry, we had several phases. The first phase where people applied these machine learning algorithms, particularly those using what we call deep learning, so very, very complex neural networks which can learn data, to image analysis, because we have so many images in dentistry, radiographs, photographs, scans, and so on. And we've seen by now a number of AI tools, software tools in the market, which focus on that task. And over the last 3-4 years, with the advent, of course, of ChatGPT as a very prominent example, but many other large language models, we have now focused a lot to language analysis and language generation. And especially these large language models, or we oftentimes call them foundational models, because by now they can do a range of things. They are not very narrow any longer. They can do lots of different things. They are very powerful for research as well, as many people in the audience will have already tried out. They can generate things. So we're talking about a subtype of AI, generative AI. But of course, they can also analyze stuff, like analyzing tabular data for specific things like statistical analysis, data depiction, image generation, or generating tables from text. We will talk about these applications later on. And that is something which, because it helps us so much in research and because it's a very powerful tool, it really, really has dramatic impact on dentistry and dental research as well. Both good impact, but also risks and potential negative impact.
Did you want to add anything to this, Nick? Is there something else you wanted to talk about? Perhaps, yeah.
I think that's a really great summary. Thank you very much, Falk. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the role of AI in publishing, which is really what we're about in this webinar. So obviously there are many different uses of AI within dental oral and craniofacial research, and some of them are to conduct the research itself, and some of them are around preparing the manuscript and publishing your work. And so there are different areas where people may use AI, and there are different levels of guidance and types of guidance around the use of AI for any of these applications. And I don't think anyone sort of is giving the message that we should not be using AI. This is a new tool, and it has a lot of potential, and it can do a lot of good. And in many domains, it can be used appropriately and well. But there are also risks of AI. And if it's used inappropriately and it's not overseen correctly, then it can cause a lot of harm. So there's a lot of concern in the area that if we misuse AI and use it inappropriately, then we'll end up with problems. And that's why it's such a hot topic. And I think everyone in academia sees this in all different aspects, from teaching our students and how they perform in exams and how they learn material, right through to how we publish our research and how we conduct our research. So it's a really important topic, and we will be focusing particularly, of course, on the publishing process. But I think for reviewers looking at papers, you also need to be aware of how AI is being used potentially in the study itself.
So, so it sounds to me as though there are some things that authors can use AI for in writing their reports, and there's some things that they shouldn't be. So perhaps Falk, maybe you could address what authors can do and can't do, and whether they need to declare whether they've used AI in their reports.
Yes, thank you. And Nick touched this already a little bit. AI is a tool. This is how we have to understand it. It's an instrument. We can do very different things. So it's a versatile tool, but it's a tool which can help us speed up the process of research and discovery, maybe even making it better in many instances. And as Nick said, there's nothing to be said against using AI for certain subtasks in the academic or research pipeline. Before submitting to a specific journal, authors should, of course, check the different guidelines, because different journals have different policies. At JDR, it is okay to use AI for example, polishing text, for also maybe generating certain analytic figures like statistical figures from tabular data, and afterwards then, of course, making it very transparent that you used AI for these purposes. What is most important to me is not only the transparency, though. It is that authors need to make sure that they check this stuff. Especially these generative AI tools, they have high risks of hallucination. And also the analytical ones, they sometimes do this. They just make up stuff. And that's why it's so important that we humans remain in the driver's seat, and that we check whatever we have used AI for. Is it true? Does it make sense to us? Is it grounded in the data? And I just discussed it. If you want to generate, let's say, a bar chart or something like this from AI, make sure that before you do this, that you check also the distribution of the data, that you use the AI tool very similar to what you would have used R or SPSS, because at the end, it's nothing different. It computes using different R modules or various software tools, but it does it without you doing the work itself. So it's very important that after having used it for certain purposes, analytical purposes or whatsoever, that we make whatever we have generated or analyzed our own, that we are very, very certain, okay, I can be responsible for this because I've thoroughly checked it. And then, of course, at the end, is very important for transparency reasons, but maybe also for reasons of meta research, that we are transparently declaring, for this subtask, I've used AI. There's nothing bad in doing this, because nobody would have said it's bad in using R instead of SPSS just because it's a different way of analyzing data, or having your manuscript being proofread by a certain proofreading company. We've always done this, but we need to be transparent about this, and we need to be able afterwards to take the responsibility for this, because otherwise we are shifting away the responsibility to a machine, and that's not really possible. This more is a philosophical debate, but at the end, it should be us making sure that this is our work, we contributed to it, and we make it our own and are responsible for it.
So, Nick, would you like to add to that as well?
Yeah. So I think these are all very good points. And in terms of publishing itself and what you can do when you're preparing your manuscript, I would certainly recommend that authors take a look at the guidelines from the International Association of Scientific, Technical, and Medical Publishers, otherwise known as STM. So this is one body that oversees the whole of medical publishing, essentially. And while each different journal does have their own approach to AI, so you do need to be aware of journal guidelines, as Falk mentioned, but there is some consistency through bodies like STM that provide overarching guidelines. And they put together a document last year in 2025 that talks about the different types of AI that you might use while you're preparing your manuscript. So this is focused very much on the manuscript preparation and not on the use of AI within the research itself. But what they say, for example, is that if you simply use tools to sort of correct the grammar or predictive typing, those don't need to be declared because these are now accepted as sort of general tools. But pretty much any other use of AI within preparing your manuscript needs to be declared. And they give examples of what sorts of things might be declared and how you go about declaring them. And also talk about some areas where actually it's not really appropriate at all to use these generative AI tools. You need to sort of put your own thought into some aspects. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're transparent and declare what you've done with AI, then it's up to the editor to decide whether or not that's reasonable. So we do still, as editors, we will have a look, and if there are things that we think really wouldn't be appropriate, we will push back on those. So we'll try and put a link to that STM document around this webinar.
So just so everyone understands, so the JDR and the JDR CTR, we follow the same guidance because we're both published through Sage Publishing. And if you want specific details on exactly what you can use and declare, what you need to declare, and what you shouldn't be using, you just go to the Sage guidance and online, and Sage has very clear, specific guidelines. As Nick said, that most journals accept and just describe to their writers and their reviewers in different ways. So there's not a lot of radical differences, as Nick said, amongst different publishers, but just go to Sage and you can see exactly what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. So, so to go on to the next topic. So, so should reviewers, should editors, as Nick suggested, editors and reviewers look out for AI and be aware, and how do reviewers do this? Because none of us really have been working with AI as extensively, perhaps as Falk and other individuals who are immersed in AI. So how do we look out for this? So I think that the first one would be Nick. So why don't you go ahead and address this question?
Yeah, so thanks, Jocelyne. So this webinar is really particularly for reviewers, and as a reviewer, I think you should, when you read articles, you should be looking out with the mindset that authors may have misused AI potentially. So you just need to be alert to that possibility because it is becoming or at least AI tools are becoming very common nowadays, and we are seeing poor practice or malpractice occurring in the publishing sphere. So you need to be alert to it. At the same time, it's not necessarily very easy to detect AI. If we had tools that could do it easily, we would implement them at the journal level and save our reviewers from the work of having to have this mindset. We used to do that for plagiarism. Well, we still do it for plagiarism, but plagiarism we can detect, AI is not so easy. The current tools are not really satisfactory. So as a reviewer, there are some things you can look out for and think about. Sometimes, for example, the complexity of the paragraph structure. So humans are likely to have more sentences in a paragraph than AI tools. So there are certain things, if you feel that the writing's not quite right, the diversity in sentence structures. So again, humans tend to make more complex sentences, and the sort of variability in the length of sentences, short followed by long, can be an indication of use of AI. Certain punctuation marks that are unique to human writing, brackets, semicolons, colons, and so on. And AI won't necessarily use these. And things like although and however and but and because, those tend to be more associated with human writing than AI. So if you see those, you might allay your concerns. But these are just small indicators, and I guess we all get used as we use these kind of tools more. We perhaps get used to the outputs, and they do look a little bit different from human writing, but it's really not very easy to spot. And so please do be alert, but we recognize that if you may not spot it, but if you do have any concerns, what I would say is write in the confidential comments to the editor, and explain that you maybe have some concerns, explain what they are and why, and then the editors can look carefully, and that's very helpful. Falk, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thank you. You covered already some of these signs, and I think those of us who work a lot with these tools, they get a feeling of how this text feels. As you said, it just feels different. It oftentimes feels a bit, sometimes it feels more like slightly shallow. Well, so these AI tools, they can blow up 1,500 words text into 10,000 words of text easily with one click, but that doesn't mean that there's much more content in there. It's just more blah, 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 blah. And this is also a sign when you read these texts, specifically discussion parts. And I mean, I receive papers from a lot of people who send something to me and say, can you have a look? And oftentimes you think, okay, that part, that was heavily written or at least co-written by AI tools, because you feel that there's not much to be said when you really boil it down into bullet points, but there's a lot of 3 or 4 pages of text. So I agree with you, checking for this is important, because obviously that's also closely linked to quality. One thing which I would really encourage reviewers to do is to check the references, because the reviewers are hopefully, and at JDR and JDR CTR, we are lucky that we do have such reviewers. They are experts in their field, they're domain experts. They know the literature to a certain topic. So go into the references, check the literature. Is this really fitting? Are these articles which you see they're really fitting with what you would have used in the same paper? And are these articles existing? Are you familiar with them? Because these large language models, they tend to even hallucinate references. They just make them up. They place them there. The journals exist, the authors exist, but the paper has never existed. So you really need to be quite sharp when you look at this and make sure that maybe you check those where you feel that this is weird. I've never heard of this before. Why is this in my field? I'm not an expert there. Or when you feel that something with the times can't fit because you know that this colleague hasn't been around at that time, or maybe he's retired and the paper is from 2025. So go into the references list and check them, because this is, I think, one of the main areas, and we know this from studies, there's lots of data on this, that AI hallucinates these references. And there are also a number of further indicators to this, certain words which are heavily used. Sergio Uribe published a very nice paper recently on this, where they give us an indication, okay, this was written by AI. And again, this is not necessarily, using AI is not necessarily the biggest problem there, but the lack of transparency of why have you used it, for what have you used it, and even more so the lack of validity. Because if you use references which aren't there, that's a huge problem, of course, for the scientific process. It's not so much that you polish the text, but that you made up references and maybe you haven't even spotted that. That would worry me a lot, because if an author hasn't spotted this, that means that he might not have spotted lots of other things, and the overall paper might be heavily flawed.
Thank you very much. So this is all really, really interesting. Is it possible that could editors or reviewers use AI to detect AI? That someone might think that that's a good idea. Falk, you're up first on this one.
Yeah, that's tempting. And to be honest, we see this. We see reports where, again, using the same indicators which you just heard, you already know this report was AI generated. It's not, and not as I'm not naming any specific journals, but this happens because it's easy. It's easy, and some collaborations like the global burden of disease, they even say, well, if we have the feeling that you generated this, you are out forever because it's not helping the review process, and it's also questionable with regards to the scientific validity. So the call for all of our reviewers and editors, don't use AI for assessing these papers, and that is also heavily related to another factor, confidentiality. These papers, they will be picked up by the AI, and the AI systems, they will grab all the text, learn from it, and so on. So during the review process, these papers are not supposed to appear anywhere. They're not supposed to be distributed. It's a confidential process. So I'm heavily urging all of us not to use AI for writing these reviews. I get a lot of review invitations as well, and it's tempting to speed this up and to always say yes and then put it into ChatGPT and having it done within 30 seconds, but that's not what we should do. Rather decline it, as much as it hurts me if you don't find time, than using an AI tool, because this review process is a heavily human process. We have the expertise. We also have the context around these papers. We know what else has been published around. We know maybe what kind of initiatives are underway. We have a perspective on these kind of things from a macro lens, which AI tools in many, many cases won't have. And again, at the end, it's also a question of responsibility and of confidentiality.
Thank you, Falk. Nick, do you want to add a bit to this?
Yeah, of course, and I totally agree with that. If we wanted an AI written review, the editors could easily do it themselves. We don't need to send it to a reviewer. Obviously, when it comes to the lower levels, sort of predictive typing type, low level grammar editing, then the sort of AI tools that are built into word processor programs nowadays, those are fine, but we wouldn't even encourage you really to go overboard with, for example, putting your review report into AI. Again, partly for confidentiality issues, but also because AI might write it in pretty words, but it does tend to make things, it loses a lot of the sharpness and the depth, as Falk has mentioned. So, and again, it starts to look a bit artificial, and that worries both the editors and the authors. So we wouldn't recommend overly sort of editing your own reports, even with AI tools.
So this leads into another question on how do we screen for paper mills and fraudulent publications? Because Falk, you touched on that in your response. I'm going to go first to Nick to answer this one. How do we screen for paper mills and fraudulent publications? And then Falk, you can follow up after Nick.
So that's a very good question, and it's a very important topic at the moment in publications. I just wanted to sort of highlight one area in particular where AI has been misused in publishing to a large extent. I think part of understanding and being able to combat some of these inappropriate uses is about being aware of what's going on. And so I think it's important that everyone's clear that this is happening. We do have paper mills that essentially make up papers and then sell the authorship for a fee. And so these can be entirely fraudulent papers, or they can be papers that were written with the help of AI that are essentially meaningless, but they're selling the authorship. And one area where AI has really ended up generating a lot of unhelpful papers is in these large epidemiological data sets. So some of the very open data sets like UK Biobank, and in the US we have the NHANES data. These are large epidemiological studies. They're repeated frequently, but they're sometimes released and made open in such a way that AI tools can actually trawl through them. And so people can use AI to do the entire process of generating the research and the paper. And you could, for example, get AI to start testing two different variables and looking for associations within a data set like NHANES. Bear in mind, NHANES has something like 400 different variables that it's collecting from all the people around the US. And so AI can simply match two. Now, that's totally unhelpful. And it's been estimated that there have been over 11,000 of these, what they call formulaic papers, that are basically just generated from testing two variables. They're not helpful. All they do is muddy the waters. They look like genuine science, but they're not genuine science. They're just AI tools generating these papers. And so I think it's important that reviewers are aware that this is happening. And if you do have concerns, again, I would say definitely flag them to the editor. In any case, these papers tend to look artificial and look unhelpful, and you probably suggest rejecting them anyway. But if you're at all concerned, do please flag it to the editorial team. Yeah. So Falk.
Yeah, you mentioned already very important things in that direction there, because it's a huge concern. Having all these useless papers, you use the word there, muddy the water, out there, they make it impossible at some point to really sift through it and find the good, the meaningful, the impactful research, because there's so much other stuff which is basically just not informative, not helpful, not advancing the field at all. But if we're really honest, this is also upon us to some degree. It's the academic system which has allowed this to become so perverted to some degree, because our incentives are going into that direction. If there wasn't such a pressure on researchers to publish, they probably wouldn't go there and spend a lot of money on stuff which they even know that this is likely not good, and they certainly know that it is likely not okay. So what we need to think about is how can we make sure that the incentive systems are also somewhat reoriented. And we discussed this a lot in the past, that maybe, for example, also strengthening the peer review process is very important. Maybe people in the academic arena should be heavily rewarded also in their career for being peer reviewers, and not having to be, this is something they shouldn't be, not only do this in the evening after their work, it should be an inherent part of the academic work itself, instead of maybe writing the 150th paper, which is not really helpful for the community. So this is one thing to think about. I think another thing is we need to talk about open and fair data. So really making sure that if we have a piece of research, we can scrutinize it, we can appraise it, we can try to redo it to some degree. That won't always be possible. In JDR and JDR CTR, we have these new data policies where we actively ask authors to put as much data as they can into their submissions, so that both reviewers but also editors can scrutinize the data. And it's very important that we do this, because reusing data and replicating studies, it sounds like someone is stealing your data, but that's not the case. We are just making science better. We are trying to avoid all the problems. We know that they are already embedded in the scientific system. And we all know that since the Lancet series 10, 15 years ago, that they said 80% of science is basically useless because it's not reproducible. It might not even be impactful. And this is the last point, which is very important to me. We may need to shift to incentivizing publications and academic activity differently. I mentioned peer review already, but maybe also incentivizing impact. Not doing 10 papers, but doing the right paper, which advances the field, which has either a clinical impact or a societal impact, or generally activities which have a meaning to the scientific system and to societies and humanity at the end. And the paper was, in that point of view, they are just a symptom of a system which has gone a little bit into the wrong direction as to how it's set up, and it's time. And maybe it's a good motivation now that we see, okay, this is really going into the very wrong direction. Now it's time to reorient our incentives and the whole setup of the system.
I just have to say, Falk, I really love your response to this. And hopefully someone who's listening to this webinar might grab the initiative and start to find ways to do so. And in the meantime, what are the consequences, not only to authors in inappropriately using AI, but also to the whole field of science? So I've expanded that question. You may not have been expecting it, but first of all, let's talk about what are the consequences for authors when they use it inappropriately, and hopefully we detect that they have done so. Nick, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, thanks, Jocelyne. And actually, the point you make about the whole field of science is really important. This is why we are so concerned about these kind of issues. If we don't maintain integrity, then it will undermine the whole scientific process. And so it's very important that we pick up on these kind of things. So if we do spot very clear cases where fraud, for example, or very clear cases of authors abusing the system, then we will take them very seriously. Now, all journals are overseen by a number of bodies. So, for example, the JDR and JDR CTR, as Jocelyne has mentioned, we're published by SAGE. SAGE have a research integrity team, and so we will very much work with their team. And all publishers, including SAGE, are then overseen by these other bodies. And for example, one of the main ones that looks at integrity issues is the Committee on Publication Ethics, known as COPE. And so we also follow their guidelines on how to handle these kind of integrity issues. We'll investigate on a case-by-case basis. If we notice a serious issue, we'll investigate. We don't tend to conduct investigations ourselves, but we will potentially contact the author's institution to ask them to investigate. So there are a number of different things that we can do. And if we feel reviewers have in some way abused the system, then we may strike them off our reviewer list. We won't go back and invite them again. Although we do obviously appreciate all the work that reviewers do. But it's very important that we get this right. And so we do follow some very clear processes.
Falk, was there anything you wanted to add to this in regards to what happens or what could happen to authors who are unethical in this regard?
Yeah, I think Nick covered already quite a lot of it. I think what is very important for authors to understand is these things, they are picked up more and more because the field is more alert and people are looking at this more actively. But also because we are more and more seeing activities like in pub peer and so on, or so peer review activities where people afterwards may also look at the peer reviews and see what was done there. So open peer review is a big issue there. And if this is picked up afterwards, people need to understand that all these things, fraudulent behavior in general, that's really bad for their career as well and for their scientific standing. So I think the benefits from getting maybe one more paper published, they heavily outweigh the potential consequences. And Nick mentioned this, we are contacting the institutions and so on, the potential consequences from this misbehavior. And I would really, really urge people to think about this as well. It's just not worth it, to be honest. And that said, as I said, it's the response and the reaction of journalists and the whole community to whatever behavior will probably also depend what was done. And as we already said several times, there are even areas where the usage of AI is not a problem, but being transparent with this, being sure that you remain accountable, and of course, maintaining confidentiality. These are cornerstones of that. And if these were breached, then this is a serious issue and could have serious consequences at the end for the individuals.
Thank you very much. That's a great summary for that question. Very, very good. While we're talking about ethics, what ethical issues should be considered when reviewers are looking at reports for clinical trials and animal studies? Nick, do you want to start with this one?
Yes, of course. So We ask authors to use appropriate reporting checklists for certain study types. We specify particularly clinical trials, observational studies, and animal studies, but these aren't the only ones where checklists are used. And actually, there are checklists as well for AI type studies and extensions for CONSORT, for example, for AI as well, if you're using AI within a clinical trial. So there are lots of different checklists that authors can use, and we encourage their use wherever appropriate, and we mandate their use for certain things. Now, reviewers should be aware of these checklists, and in an ideal world, we would ask reviewers to thoroughly check every single point on the checklist. But realistically, we understand that some of these checklists are quite lengthy, and it does take a long time to go through them. So I would encourage reviewers at the very minimum to sort of be aware of the checklists and to maybe look at a sample of the checklist items that you might think are particularly important, and just see whether or not the authors have actually done what they say they've done on the checklist. The checklists are designed to make it as easy as possible. Give us a page number, so you can look at an item, look at the page number. Does it actually work? And this is important because we do know that a number of things slip through even with these checklists. So, for example, we've just published a paper recently in the JDR looking at adherence to the ARRIVE checklist and guidelines for animal studies. And quite a few items on these ARRIVE checklists were not properly reported, and particularly areas such as sample size, inclusion-exclusion criteria, and randomization, which perhaps isn't as well adhered to or well known about in animal studies as it is in human clinical trials. So these kinds of things are not being reported properly. And if we're going to improve the science and we want studies to be done correctly, then these are all things that reviewers could look at and pick up on. But as I say, I would do it with a sampling approach. But if you do find that there are problems, then please do include that in your peer review report.
Falk, can you contribute to this this discussion? I think you have some comments.
Yeah, and coming back maybe very briefly to this point of the checklist, I think this is for authors such an easy way of making the paper a good paper. And I usually wonder why people are not always writing. I use the checklist and then use all the subheadings of the checklist. It helps you to structure the paper. It helps the editors and the reviewers to know that, okay, that person thought about this. They have an internal structure. They try to be as comprehensive and adhering to whatever guidances are out there. So I'm always surprised that people are not using the checklist. Right? For me, it's the first thing I do is I check the checklist. So what I can recommend reviewers, and I don't think it takes much time, just look at the subheadings as Nick outlined. This is all I do at the beginning. I look into the methods part, and the results part are all the subheadings for, I don't know, health economic studies or CONSORT for RCTs or STROBE for observational studies. Are they there? And if they're not there and they write, oh, we adhere to CONSORT and half of it is missing, then I know, okay, I don't know what version you adhere to, but obviously not the version I'm reading now. So that already signs a warning to me, and that's something I would certainly write to the authors. One other thing which comes back to the ethical issues in general and the problems and the quality which problems we are facing is registration. Clinical trials, but also increasingly so systematic reviews and these kind of papers, they should be registered upfront because it helps us to avoid selective outcome reporting. It helps to disclose or identify undisclosed protocol changes. It helps to reduce publication bias and so on. So it really makes studies better. And if people, especially with CONSORT, I think everybody in the realm of randomized trials is doing this now, and we really need to expect these things to be pre-registered somewhere to make quality better than it has been in the past. And we know that these kind of registration make quality better. We saw this over the last 10, 15 years in studies as well, showcasing it. The other thing is what we also can do is we can look at ethics approval, of course. This is also very important in any kind of human, but also animal studies. Nick mentioned this. And we still see that there's lots of debates in some cases around at least certain types of human associated research, like surveys, like retrospective data analysis, and so on. In many numerical studies, I would look for sample size estimation. It's also part of many of the checklists, by the way, that you ask, how did you arrive at your sample size? Why did you have 40 or 400 people involved there? And many other things. So the main message is make sure to check these things up front. It showcases to the reviewers that if you have done this both during your planning but also during your reporting, that you thought about what you're doing, that you had a plan in mind up front already when designing the study, when analyzing it, and when reporting it. And that's just helping the reviewers to understand what you have done, but it's also a good sign of the quality of your paper.
Thank you very much. So I just to kind of finish up on the questions for both of you, and starting with Falke, how do you see the use of AI in publishing evolving in the future? Like, we know where we're at right now. We need to put a lot of effort into our own. We're actually having to police this in a sense. How do you see its use in publishing evolving?
Yeah. This is a very complex and forward-looking question. I think with AI evolving, we will also evolve. I think we will be developing a stronger sense of what we want to allow and what we don't want to allow. And I assume now we will end up more on the we allow side for many, many things. Let's start with one typical example of where many people are discussing AI usage: systematic reviews and meta-analysis. We know from a lot of studies that AI can identify studies. They can do the search if you define in an exclusion criteria properly. Agentic AI systems can probably run through a PubMed nearly as good as humans can do that. With some limitations, I come to them in a second. AI can extract data from studies. If you upload 100 PDFs of studies into AI, the good newer versions of AI tools, and they differ. For example, ChatGPT is not particularly good at this. Others are better. I don't want to explain this too much here because it's not my place here. It's not an AI webinar. But that it can be used for data extraction as well. As I said, these tools can also be used for data analytics to some degree. So compiling data, identifying patterns, analyzing data descriptively. That really, really works. And at some point, we will need to ask ourselves, why are we using human capacity for these kind of tasks? If we know that this works, why don't we just let a machine do it? What we then need to do, however, is coming back to what we said right at the beginning. We need to make sure that we remain accountable and responsible, and that we are 100% certain that this is okay, that this is not hallucinated, that this is not made up stuff, because these AI systems tend to do this. And that will be a big task nevertheless. So we will have automated maybe 40% of the process, but checking all of this, making sure it's right and so on, that will nevertheless be a big task. But there are even people out there, and it's just a very provocative statement I'm making here, which say, why do we write systematic reviews in 5 years? Why is a human writing systematic reviews? AI will probably, for most of the process, be as good as a human. And we should focus our human tasks, our time, to many, many other things, like being accountable, making sure to scrutinize these kind of things, maybe thinking about what does this mean for implementation? How can we use these messages from any systematic review and bring them into the clinical arena and implement them? Because there we have a huge gap. So I think we will divert our attention to different things. And in parallel, we need to very much more than we have done, because it's a new field. We need to develop guidance as to what to disclose, where to use AI, what to really, really thoroughly check and appraise, and so on. So there's lots of homework for the governance arena in this whole field to be done in the future.
Very interesting. Nick, can you add something to this as well?
Yeah, so I totally agree that there will be areas where AI will be very helpful, and in fact, I'm sure there are plenty of areas already where AI is very helpful. And so what I would encourage people to do is to make sure that you actually try out these tools yourself and see how you can incorporate them into your own research. The problem is, if you don't do that, then you don't know what the tools look like. You don't know what AI generated content looks like. And so it becomes much harder then to spot in other people's work. So So I think we should all try new tools, as with all new technologies, give them a go, but be very aware of their limitations and be very aware of when it's appropriate to use them and when it's not appropriate to use them. And a lot of the writing does need human oversight. They talk about human in the loop for all these AI procedures. I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we really trust AI enough that we can just rely on it. And of course, the other point with AI is it's very good at summarizing and pulling together what information exists already out there on the internet. What it's not good at is generating new information. And so there will always be a need for people to conduct new scientific research and generate information. So I think we should be trying AI, we should be incorporating it, using it as a tool, but being very careful. And we do need to be conscious, as with the wider debate on how AI potentially can take over and can replace certain jobs, and potentially is that actually a good thing, putting lots of people out of work? But we'll have these same sort of issues in academia. How do we make sure that we sort of still have a system that works well while AI is around there? So I think there are lots of challenges, lots of exciting opportunities in terms of the publishing field and in terms of reviewing. I think it's really important to be aware and to keep up to date as these tools continue to evolve. So I'm sure if we revisit this webinar, even in a couple of years' time, the landscape will look quite different from now. So it's important that we keep up and that we keep monitoring.
Thank you so much. That finishes the questions. So if I can start a summary, and you both can kind of join in if I've missed something important. But basically, we're looking at a disruptive technology, which, I mean, obviously has been around for a while, but it's disruptive to, at least to our, in this topic, our publishing and report generation. And so like any new technology, we need to become familiar with it. We should absolutely try using AI itself. We can even look and see, if we ask it to generate a report, we can look and see how that report looks. As reviewers, we can see how that report looks, and it will start to help us become more familiar with what generative AI would look like if we're reading a report that we're intending to review. So play with it, play with AI. Read the guidelines in the SAGE instructions to authors on AI. They're very clear. They're very simple. Keep up with our checklists and make sure that people are pre-registering the appropriate types of studies. I also just want to say that as reviewers, you're really the people, all of us in the publishing area, we're the people that are basically safeguarding the scientific process right now. AI, as you know, has tremendous potential, but it also has tremendous potential to destroy the science that we've built for so long. And we're kind of like the gatekeepers on all of this. So we hope that this webinar has been helpful to you. And if you have additional questions or concerns, things you think you would like to see more of from the editors, we'd be happy to do additional webinars. Please do let us know. And thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Falk. And thank you very much to all of our reviewers of the JDR and the JDR CTR.